I'm coming back to a Zoom room filled with no other video participants, and so I just have to trust that people are back. But oh, hi guys. I do want to invite folks, if it feels good to them, to turn on their videos. I think it can be nice to wrap these things up with a sense of community, that we're all sort of here, at least virtually. I think it can be the difference between the feeling like you're watching something on YouTube and the feeling like you're really actually present for something. Nice to see some of your faces. Thank you. I want to start with a bit of introduction about myself. I think, like Ella and Nicholas, I wear a couple different hats in my professional life. One is as a researcher at the University of Oxford, where I do work on decarbonizing heavy industry. Another is a fellow at the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is a nonprofit in Colorado that works on transforming the global energy system. And lastly, I'm a Gates Scholar at the University of Cambridge, where I work on the politics of climate change. And I want to be clear that what I'm talking about today, what Layla invited me to speak about, is very much with my Cambridge hat on. The political issues are thorny and difficult and challenging, and I'm very lucky to have one hat where I can sort of speak about those a little directly. And before I begin, I also want to thank all of our other speakers and the organizers who put together today's program. This is a really amazing opportunity for folks, and Layla in particular, thank you for all of your hard work on this. This is really a remarkable gathering, and I'm glad so many people got to participate. And finally, because I think this is our last sort of structured traditional session of the day, I just want to say, folks should feel free to reach out to me afterwards with any follow-up questions. I'd love to hear from you guys. And if you look for me on the internet, it's easy enough to find my email address, and I'd be very happy to hear from you guys. So what I want to talk about today is something that has been brewing on my mind for the last couple of years, and I think it came about largely in parallel with a shift in what's happening in our global climate politics right now. And I don't usually write down speeches, but this is something that I really actually wanted to put to paper, because I think it's important to get these things right, because I think we're coming into a new political moment. And so there are three things that I want to talk about here. And the first is the importance of holding climate change in context with the other problems that the world is facing. The second is the importance of pushing back against the idea that the work that we do on climate is an all or nothing battle. And the third and final thing that I want to talk about is why it matters that our activism and our advocacy is really connected to the places and the creatures and the people that we love, and goes beyond a connection to something as abstract as global average surface air temperature. So sometimes I wake up and I imagine that climate change itself is all sort of a bad dream, and that atmospheric CO2 concentration is 350 parts per million, and climate change is just this awful collective nightmare. And when I imagine waking up like that, I sort of feel like I would cry with relief. But it would only be a brief moment of relief before I remembered that the world is still facing a huge number of intractable and overlapping crises. If climate change were gone tomorrow, this would still be a very difficult world for a lot of people to live in. The planet's landscapes would still be under pressure from agriculture and extractive industries and urban sprawl. The world's oceans would still be driven toward disaster by overfishing and pollution. Aquifers would still be running dry, and rivers would still be dammed. Indigenous communities across the planet would still be struggling for the right not just to exist, but to thrive. There would still be wars, and minorities would still be persecuted, and political dissenters would be jailed. The world's refugees would still be looking for a safe place to call home. There would be new infectious diseases, which would break out and hopefully recede. This is all to say that we acknowledge that if we fail in our work to slow and then stop climate change, that all of these other problems will become worse. But even if we achieve 1.5 degrees warming as an upper limit, that is not on its own sufficient to create a more just and equitable and wild planet to live on. I'm not saying this as a pessimist, but I'm saying it because our generation cannot forget that even though climate change might be the biggest and most important battle of the moment, it's not the only one. And sometimes in our rhetoric, we become so narrowly focused on climate change that it seems as though we exclude everything else that also has to be addressed. So why does this matter? A reasonable person could say, we know what the most urgent issue is, it's climate change. That's what we should focus on right now. And to that person, I would answer that it matters because there's a growing narrative around the world that implies, indirectly, but still implies, that if we can only stop climate change, then we can get back to business as usual, get back to the way the world was in the good old days of 2007, when things were really, really good in 2007. And this narrative, which we know to be problematic, is held by influential people around the world for whom climate change is an interruption rather than a turning point. So I see this language, for instance, coming out of many large corporations for whom climate change is a risk to continued profit. And I see this same language from authoritarian governments for whom climate change is a risk to continued social control. There are people who have a stake in preserving the world's current configuration, who are rightfully worried that climate change will disrupt a system that is already fine-tuned to their benefit. I'm not suggesting that these actors are heartless or evil or that they don't care about the billions of livelihoods threatened by climate disaster. But I am saying that the growing climate consensus that we see around the world may be increasingly aligned with preserving rather than transforming. This is the narrative that young climate leaders are standing up against. It's what Greta Thunberg spoke out against a couple months ago when she said, quote, "If this is what they consider to be climate action, then we don't want it." The activism to make climate change a transformative event rather than an interruption is what's driving conversations about a global Green New Deal. It's what leads young climate leaders to object to this idea that climate change is a glitch in a system that was already good enough. It's what leads folks to demand that climate change become a catalyst to transition away from something that's fundamentally flawed and toward a more livable planet that's defined in terms that are more than just about temperature. So I would say that even as we tackle climate change head on, we have to keep our peripheral vision open to remind ourselves that we're trying to do something that goes beyond just stabilizing the Earth's temperature. It's precisely for that reason that we can't sink into despair. I think we've all heard these elegies that get written for a planet that is not yet lost. And we've heard people speak about the Anthropocene as though the future were already set in stone, when in reality, as Ella and Nicholas said, the script for this new epoch has hardly been written. And it's currently being written in the choices that we're all making today collectively. So even as we mourn for the losses in the present, even as we're sad about what is being inevitably lost, we also need to set aside this melancholy to draw a blueprint for the world that we're trying to build going forward, and not only focus on the world that we're trying to avoid, because we know that our vision is about more than just one issue. I think it's tempting for folks to categorize this as hope, but I think it's something a little different from hope. And I say that because hope is something that can exist in really dark times. I think of a single star on a dark night. But what we need to think of an entirely different future has to be brighter than that. It has to be brighter than hope. We're looking for a sun, or at the very least, a full moon, something that can actually light up the landscape in front of us. In the last couple years, as I mentioned earlier, I began to feel for the first time that we might avoid cataclysmic climate change. Deep decarbonization doesn't rely on unproven technology anymore, and concern about climate change is rapidly gaining momentum across the world. This is not to say that the warming that we've already baked into the atmosphere won't cause widespread climate disaster, but there are reasons to think that we might avoid the worst of the possible self-inflicted harm. I'm not saying that we will, but I'm saying that we could. For me, this existential dread, I'm seeing a way out of it. And this shift reminds me of my parents, who grew up in the 1960s and 1970s with the fear of nuclear war. They were growing up in the United States, and at school they would practice what were called fallout drills, where they would hide under the table and pretend that there was a nuclear attack, which is, I think, even scarier than the idea of climate change. But there are still over 10,000 nuclear weapons on the planet, and yet the fear of nuclear annihilation doesn't keep most of us awake at night anymore. I think it's possible that in our lifetimes, there will be a future of young people who might be post-climate in the way that our generation is post-nuclear. Not because climate change will disappear, but because climate change could become normalized in the same way that the threat of nuclear war was normalized and replaced by a new danger that requires more urgent attention. And that might sound like a dark future, but it's actually something that we should strive for. Because if there is a post-climate generation, it would be a sign that anthropogenic climate change was limited enough that we avoided the worst possible catastrophes. The idea that there could be our children or our grandchildren or great-grandchildren who are thinking about something else would be a sign of success. Now, whether that is likely or not is a matter of opinion, but it is the future that we're trying to build, where people can focus on this long list of other crises rather than this one issue. I think that by keeping this post-climate future in mind, we remind ourselves that the Earth's climatic trajectory is not binary. It's not either we saved the world or we didn't save the world. There are an infinite number of possibilities between those 2 points. And as the climate becomes more dire, our work matters even more. It's the opposite of this question that people ask me, where they say, do you think we're going to make it? And the reality is that the worse things get, the more important our contribution becomes. Here's something from the latest IPCC report. Climate scientists modeled what percentage of greenhouse gas emissions absorbed by the planet's oceans and atmospheres, or are absorbed by the planet's oceans and atmospheres, and then what percentage linger in the air where they cause the most harm. And this is a little tricky to explain, but as global cumulative emissions rise, as we emit more, the percentage of emissions that linger in the atmosphere linger as well. Meaning that for every kilogram of CO2 that's emitted in 2040, that kilogram of CO2 does more to warm the planet than a kilogram of CO2 emitted today, because more of it stays in the atmosphere. And Ella and Nicholas will correct me if I'm wrong. At the same time, the marginal damage that emissions cause to the planet also increase with warming. So that kilogram of CO2 emitted in 2040 does more harm to humans and to ecosystems than the kilogram of CO2 emitted today. So when folks ask if we're going to stop climate change before it's too late, I tell them that there's no such thing as too late. Climate change can always get worse. And in fact, the worse it gets, the more important our work becomes. So what I like to think about is that no matter how awful the present situation is, there will always be something left to save. This is how I resist the temptation to think of climate change in terms of absolutes. Yes, there may be planetary tipping points. Ella mentioned the West Antarctic ice sheet. But climate scientists are still unable to say with certainty what parts per million of CO2 concentration will cause tipping point X or tipping point Y. And maybe that'll come in AR7 or AR8, but in the meantime, it's our job to put forward a future, to put forward a vision for the future that is more nuanced than a choice between the end of the world or back to normal. Most of us are already doing that work, but the challenge ahead that I want to speak to today is to make sure that we communicate a vision for a world that is more than just climate stabilized, but that is different and better than the world that we inherited. So what does that look like in practice? It means ensuring that when we do our work, we operate in a tone that isn't just avoidant, but that is also visionary. It means demanding that climate policy serves as a catalyst to create a new world instead of simply restoring an old one. It means taking a pause from fear and dread to articulate clearly that we're trying to build a world that is more peaceful and equitable and wilder than the status quo. This is not just about saving something. It's about going that next step to creating something new. I think part of why this is challenging for us is that it requires to break out of the bubble of our work. Many of us, myself included, spend our days reading white papers and news articles, following IPCC reports, and working with these hyper-detailed issues of regulation or market transformation. And we do this work across countries and continents and time zones and languages. And it's important, but in the process, we become lost in the details and also uprooted from our homes and our communities. We become sort of global climate experts without a real sense of place. I think it's worth adding that, ironically, the pandemic has exacerbated this dislocation. This comes at a time when so many of us changed our lives to stay at home, but in the process, we actually became more digital and placeless than ever. And we migrated into these online spaces that are not local to anywhere. And these patterns, these trends, these habits make it harder than ever to really identify why it is that we're doing this work. When we talk about the grand narrative of climate change, the idea that we are in a battle to save the planet, that's a global and placeless story. It doesn't have a location. There's no location for the end of the world. It has archetypes like the melting Arctic and dying coral reefs, but it is principally quantified in global terms like rising temperatures and parts per million of CO2. We know that's what we want to avoid. But the world that we'd like to build is difficult to describe on a planetary scale. This is obvious, by the way, because if we could describe the world we want to build in global terms, we would be describing a new imperialism, which is obviously not something we want to build. But what I mean by this is that the world we'd like to live in has to be described with reference to a particular place rather than a planetary atmosphere. By place, I don't mean a region or a nation state or a trading bloc or a common market. I'm talking about the emotional and physical connection to the earth that is so easy to neglect. I'm talking about the feeling of soil in your hands, or the smell of a forest in the rain, or the sight of snow in a neighborhood, or the sound of birds in the evening. But the content and the process of our work takes us away from this strong sense of place. This connection to places, to locales, was not a problem in the first great wave of European environmentalism in the 60s and 70s. This was before the rapid rise in global temperatures and before the recognition of the growing hole in the ozone layer. This was a time when environmentalism was local by necessity. There wasn't a conception that there was a single global environmental issue. It was an aggregation of many local ones. That didn't mean it was provincial. Where you had concern for the rainforest and opposition to commercial whaling, people were thinking very far away from their homes. They were thinking about places and people and living creatures. And at the root of the activism was a sense of connection and love for these people and places. So I offer a hypothesis for us all. When we act out of love for a specific place or community or ecosystem, it's far easier to imagine what we want in addition to what we wish to avoid. Flourishing takes place on a local scale, not in the atmosphere, but on solid ground or in water. So if this hypothesis is correct, then coming around to a climate politics that is equally focused on creating a better world as avoiding an awful one requires, as Bruno Latour puts it, coming down to earth. It means locating our climate politics, not just in the atmosphere, but also on the ground. I want to add, just in case anyone misinterprets me, that I'm not speaking out against cosmopolitanism. Connection to place can happen from anywhere, and it can happen by anyone. And there's a difference between identity and modality. Identity is not the issue here. The more important consideration is modality, by which I mean how we live and work and play, and whether our day-to-day lives connect us with the world that we're hoping to save. Landscapes, communities, creatures, cultures. Coming back down to earth keeps our work rooted in this ethic of care. It opens the door to imagining the world that we hope to build, at least in the 1 or 2 corners of the planet that we care about the most. This gives our work focus beyond the anonymous catastrophe that we're trying to avoid. And finally, by focusing on something to move toward rather than just away from, we're laying the groundwork for a future where climate change is just one item on a much larger political agenda, and perhaps someday is not an issue at all. I want to close with an acknowledgement of the love that we all already bring to this work, even though at times it can get lost in the institutional and corporate cultures that we thrive in, or maybe thrive in spite of. My own mantra, which I have borrowed without permission from a colleague, goes something like this: keep up the good work. Your children and the children of all beings will thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back to Leila.
Wow, okay, thank you so much. It's a bit difficult to talk after that. Yeah, Thank you very, very much, Stephen, for this final presentation. Absolutely great. Nicola is also still in the call. Thank you so much for the panel discussion. I think it was an absolutely perfect ending for this afternoon session. We had a lot of different panel discussions, talks, and the main idea for me was to kind of showcase all of this complexity, all of the different topics related to sustainability, climate change, but also kind of like show path and bring new ideas on how we can have an impact, tackle climate change, and define a way altogether towards sustainability, which is also the goal of Yes Europe. So thank you all very much for joining. I want to give a special thank you to Roni, who did an amazing job also moderating all the talks today. Was really, really great. Thank you to all of the participants who joined. Thank you for the great questions. It was really nice to have all of you today. And of course, the team. So this event took around 5 months to organize. So it was really a pleasure to have everyone on board. So Beatrice organizing a workshop, Livia, Dimitri, Jonas co-designing the content, and Sayla with her communication team, who did an amazing job in the last couple of weeks, also to showcase all of the great speakers who joined the content of the talks, and was also really important work to just give visibility to today's event. So now we are gonna have a break, well deserved, I think, but we have the evening program coming. So that's gonna be a session a bit more interactive, where you're gonna be able to discover a bit more about Yes Europe, the different projects that we have, and also basically be able to meet the team, and so we can all talk. And Yes Europe is about knowledge sharing. It's about learning new things, but it's also about acting and engaging. And so tonight's session is also made for that, so you can yourself engage with us. So short break from 6 p.m. until 7 p.m. And then I'm looking forward to seeing you all a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all the speakers. And again, a big thank you to Leila, who led the organization of this annual conference, who contacted all the speakers and managed that very well.